The town of Port Forkin, Louisiana, was being erased. Not in the slow, quiet way small towns fade from maps, but with the immediate violence only a Gulf Coast hurricane could deliver. The sky and the sea had merged into a single, screaming wall of gray. Port Forkin was no quaint fishing village. It was a working port, a place of hard lines, rust, and the perpetual smell of salt water and diesel. Now its edges were being scoured clean by winds that drove the rain sideways, each drop a tiny projectile. This was exactly the kind of weather Jackson Crow had sought out. He ran into the wind, a solid shape moving through the chaos. Jax was a man made of lean muscle and quiet intensity. An active-duty Navy SEAL, using his leave for specialized foul-weather training, pushing his limits where nature was at its most powerful. Beside him, matching his pace with disciplined grace, was Rogue. Rogue was a powerful German shepherd, his thick black and tan coat made for the elements, his eyes intelligent and alert. He was not a pet. He was a partner, a K-9 operative trained for these exact conditions. Jax kept his breathing even, the thick, wet air burning his lungs, trusting the dog to be his eyes where he had none. The world was reduced to the squelch of their boots on the flooded asphalt of the remote parish Road 22. Rogue stopped first. The dog didn't bark, but his body went rigid, head low, scenting the air. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Easy," Jax said, his voice instantly swallowed by the storm. He paused, scanning the gray blur. "What is it?" Rogue moved toward a shape that shouldn't have been there. As Jax got closer, the form resolved. It was a Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's patrol car, its green and white markings nearly invisible in the deluge. The engine was idling high to keep the electronics running. Its emergency lights were flashing, but the dense rain muted them to weak, pulsing blurs. But the dog wasn't focused on the patrol car. Rogue was looking past it, down a slight embankment toward the dark, churning water of a bayou that had swollen over its banks. A second vehicle, a battered old pickup truck, was tilted at a terrifying angle. Its front wheels were already submerged in the floodwater, and its rear wheels were spinning uselessly, throwing up mud and spray. The truck was slipping. A figure in a dark blue rain slicker was moving frantically in the churning water near the truck. "Ma'am, you have to get out," a woman's voice yelled, strained and sharp against the wind. "The current is taking it." Jax headed down the slope, Rogue at his heels. He assessed the situation with practiced economy. One deputy, female, smaller build, currently in the unstable floodwater. One victim, elderly, still in the vehicle. The vehicle itself compromised and losing its battle with the water. Deputy Kate Riley, her name visible on her tactical vest, saw him approach. She was a woman who looked like she belonged to this hardscrabble land, with dark, focused eyes and a face raw from the wind. She had a tow strap looped around her waist, the other end hooked to the truck's frame in a desperate, futile attempt to anchor it. "Stay back," she yelled at Jax. "The ground is giving way." Jax noted her position. She was taking a risk. She was too far out. Her own weight was adding to the strain on the sodden, collapsing embankment. "You need to get out of the water, deputy," Jax said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Your anchor point isn't going to hold." "I can't leave her," Riley yelled back. She pulled on the strap, digging her boots in, trying to physically stop the slide. "Ma'am, please, give me your hand." Inside the truck, Jax could see the driver. Eliza Bro, a name most of Port Forkin knew, was a woman in her late 70s. Her face was a mask of fierce stubbornness, her white hair escaping from a wool cap. She was gripping the steering wheel. "I'm not," Eliza shouted back, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm not leaving it. It's in the back. There's no time." Riley screamed. She was panicking, her professionalism cracking under the strain. She glanced at Jax, her expression torn between duty and desperation. "Help me pull." "No," Jax said. He pointed to the water swirling around Riley's feet. "Look down." Riley froze. The muddy ground beneath her boots was visibly dissolving, sucked away by the current. Rogue, sensing the danger, let out a single, sharp, loud bark. "Ma'am, let go of the wheel," Riley pleaded, abandoning the strap and moving closer to the truck door. "It was his," Eliza cried, a note of pure anguish in her voice. "I won't lose it." It was the definitive sound of surrender. Not a crack, but a deep groan from the embankment beneath the truck's engine block. The pickup lurched, dropping a full foot. The passenger side door dipped below the dark water, and a wave of mud washed over the hood. Riley, still tied to the strap, was yanked forward, sliding toward the widening hole. "No," she gasped, fumbling with the carabiner at her waist. "Rogue, get her," Jax commanded. The dog launched forward. Rogue ignored the truck, ignored the water. He understood the order. He scrambled onto the collapsing earth, grabbing the sleeve of Riley's slicker in his teeth. His claws dug in and he pulled back, using his entire weight to drag the struggling deputy away from the edge. "Lose the strap," Jax yelled at her. At the same moment, Jax moved on the truck. There was no time for the door handle. Eliza was still clinging to the wheel, paralyzed by the sudden drop. The driver's side window was closed. Jax didn't hesitate. He smashed the tempered glass with his gloved elbow, the pop muffled by the storm. "You're coming out now," he said. Eliza recoiled, startled by his violence. Jax reached through the shattered window, his arm ignoring the jagged shards of glass. He grabbed the front of Eliza's thick coat with one hand, his grip like a steel clamp. He set his boots on the solid edge of the bank and pulled. It was a single, explosive movement of pure strength fueled by adrenaline and training. He hauled Eliza Bro out of the driver's seat, pulling her entire body through the window frame just as the truck's cabin gave its last complaint. Rogue had successfully dragged Riley back onto the muddy grass of the embankment. The three of them collapsed onto the sodden ground. Behind them, the bank gave way completely. The pickup truck slid backward, its red taillights blinking once before it plunged into the cold, dark waters of the bayou. There was a final, terrible hiss as the hot engine met the water, and then it was gone. The only sounds left were the howling wind and the desperate, ragged breathing of three people at the water's edge. The adrenaline of the rescue faded, leaving only the brutal, penetrating dampness. The wind screamed, already erasing the signs of their struggle. Kate Riley got to her feet, her body aching. She looked at the churning, dark water of the bayou, then back at her half-swamped patrol car. It was at least a quarter-mile away, and the floodwaters were already waist-deep in places. "Dispatch won't hear me in this," she said, her voice strained with frustration as she tapped the static-filled radio on her shoulder. Her professional composure was frayed, her face pale. She turned to Jax. "Your phone?" Jax shook his head, pulling down his neck gaiter. "No signal. Even if I had one, the cell tower on the point probably lost power an hour ago." He looked at Eliza. The old woman was sitting on the muddy bank, shivering violently, but her eyes were dry and furious. She was in shock, but it was anger that was keeping her lucid. "She won't last 10 minutes out here," Jax said. "We need to get her inside." "Where's your house, ma'am?" "I take no charity from O'Reilly," Eliza said, her voice thin but sharp as broken glass. Kate stiffened, her face hardening. "This isn't charity, it's survival. Your truck is gone. You can walk home or we can leave you here." It was a harsh, tactical lie, and it worked. Eliza's glare was venomous. "Up the path." "Not far," she muttered, pointing with a trembling, gloved hand toward a narrow opening in the cypress trees that Jax would have missed. "We need to move now," Jax said. He pulled her to her feet. The woman was surprisingly light, but resistant, her body stiff with pride. "Deputy, lead the way. Rogue, clear a path." The German shepherd, understanding the shift in mission, plunged into the unseen path, his powerful body creating a trail through the undergrowth. Kate went next, using her flashlight to cut through the gray curtain of rain, and Jax followed, half pushing, half carrying the stumbling old woman. The walk was short, maybe only 100 yards, but it was steep. The path was a crude staircase of stone and roots, climbing a natural levee that Jax couldn't have even seen from the road. The wind was different here. It didn't just blow. It was a solid wall of force coming directly off the roaring gulf somewhere in the darkness far below them. The house wasn't a house. It was a fortress. It was built of stone and thick timbers, anchored directly to the highest point of the levee. Its windows were small, like portholes, and a single, heavy wooden door faced the path. It looked more like a lighthouse or a military blockhouse than a home. Kate pushed the door open, her shoulder braced against the wind, and they practically fell inside. The contrast was immediate. The small main room was oppressively warm, heated by a large, pot-bellied iron stove that glowed with a dull red in the corner. But the warmth was secondary to what was inside. The room wasn't a living space. It was a museum, or perhaps a mausoleum. Every wall was covered. Hundreds of exquisitely hand-carved model boats, most no longer than his hand, sat on rough-hewn shelves. They were not toys. They were replicas, perfect in their detail, from the tiny, coiled ropes to the painted hulls. Interspersed between them were nautical charts, old and new, tacked to the walls. Detailed meteorological maps were annotated with a spiderweb of handwriting, covering a large table. The air smelled of old wood, varnish, sea salt, and something metallic like engine oil. Rogue shook the water from his thick coat, his claws clicking on the wooden floorboards. He immediately began a small patrol of the room, his nose working, cataloging the strange scents. "Get your feet off the rug," Eliza snapped. She pushed past Jax and limped to a worn armchair by the stove, sinking into it. She didn't take off her coat. She just sat and stared at them, her eyes 2 chips of ice. "I didn't ask for a police escort." "You're welcome, ma'am," Kate said, her voice laced with practiced, official sarcasm. She brushed the water from her tactical vest, her own eyes sweeping the room, taking it all in. "I need to call this in." "You got a landline?" "No," Eliza said, her eyes fixed on Kate. "Got no one to call." The barb was clearly personal. Kate's jaw tightened. Jax saw the faint, thin scar on her wrist as she clenched her fist. "Of course not," Kate muttered. She unclipped the radio from her shoulder, moving toward one of the small, deep-set windows. She extended the antenna. "Terrebonne Dispatch, this is 2 Adam 30, she said, her voice loud and clear, asserting authority in the small, cluttered room. "I'm off the parish road north of mile marker 12 with civilian Eliza Bro. Her vehicle is disabled." The radio answered with a burst of static so loud it made Rogue flinch. 2 Adam, repeat. "You're breaking up. Severe interference." "Dispatch," Kate yelled, turning the channel knob. 2 Adam 30, I have a civilian secure. "We are at the residence, we are." The signal dissolved into a high-pitched squeal and then died. Kate banged the side of the radio in frustration. A dry, brittle sound came from the armchair. Eliza Bro was laughing. It was a sound with no humor in it, like dry leaves scraping on pavement. "That box won't save you, Deputy Riley," Eliza said, her voice low and clear. "The storm doesn't care about your rules. It doesn't care about your little flashing lights." Kate turned, her patience gone. "What it does care about, Eliza, is that you drove off the road. I was trying to save your life." "You were trying to do your job," Eliza countered, her gaze shifting from Kate to a heavy, dark wooden door at the end of a short hallway. It was the only part of the house that wasn't cluttered. The door was new, thick and secured, not with a simple lock, but with a heavy, green-tinged brass padlock, the kind used on sea chests. "It doesn't let anyone go," Eliza whispered, speaking more to the door than to them. "You're trapped here now, just like everything else." Both Kate and Jax looked at the door. Rogue, drawn by Eliza's intense focus, padded silently down the hallway. He stopped a foot from the door. He didn't bark. He just stood there, head tilted, and let out a low, almost inaudible whine from deep in his chest. The fortress had just become a prison. The second day began without a sunrise. The world outside the small, deep-set windows didn't lighten. It simply shifted from a roaring black to an oppressive, milky gray. The shriek of the wind had settled into a deep, vibrating moan that they felt in their chests. The fortress on the levee was now an island in a sea of gray, and the 3 of them were its prisoners. Heat and food became the only currency. The pot-bellied stove demanded a constant diet of wood, and the small pile by the door was dwindling. "We need to ration," Jax said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the howl of the wind. He was stacking the last of the logs. "And we need a plan for water. I'll melt snow, but we need clean containers." He moved with an economy of motion, his tactical discipline having taken over. He was assessing resources, building a survival plan. Kate, who had been pacing restlessly, stopped. "I know this house. I've been here before, on a wellness check," she said, her local knowledge surfacing. "She doesn't keep much, but there's a root cellar under the kitchen. She'll have canned goods, shrimp, maybe. And I know these old stoves. You choke the flue too much, you'll fill the room with carbon monoxide. A root cellar is a good start." "Let's take inventory," Jax agreed. They worked together in the cramped kitchen space, an uneasy truce forged by necessity. Eliza watched them from her armchair, her face a mask of disapproval. She hadn't moved all morning, a silent, glaring judge. "You're wasting your time," Eliza's voice rasped from the main room. "There's nothing for you down there." Kate ignored her, pulling open a heavy trapdoor in the floor. A smell of damp earth and vinegar wafted up from the darkness. Jax clicked on a small tactical flashlight from his belt, illuminating a small, stone-lined space. It held a few dozen jars of pickled shrimp, some preserved vegetables, and sacks of potatoes. It was survival, but it was sparse. As Jax bent down to lift a heavy jar of shrimp, Kate reached for it at the same time. Their hands brushed. Jax's eyes fell to her left wrist as her sleeve pulled back. A thin, white, perfectly straight scar ran across the delicate skin. It was not an accidental scar. Kate saw him looking. Her reaction was immediate. She pulled her hand back as if burned, tugging her sleeve down to cover the mark. She said nothing, a flush creeping up her neck, and immediately turned to grab a sack of potatoes, breaking the moment. Jax didn't comment, but he filed the reaction away. The scar was a secret, a vulnerability she guarded fiercely. Meanwhile, Rogue remained unsettled. The German Shepherd had refused the small piece of dried fish Jax offered him. He paced restlessly from the main room to the hallway, his claws clicking on the floorboards. He would stand at the brass-locked door, sniffing at the threshold, ears back. A low, anxious whine would escape him before he'd return to Jax, nudge his handler's hand, and then go back to the door. "Your dog is broken," Eliza sneered from her chair. "He's restless," Jax replied, not looking at her. "He senses things. He senses what's not his business," she snapped. Just like his partner, the Rileys were always sticking their noses in the water's business. The water doesn't like to be questioned. Before Kate could respond, a sound from outside silenced the room. It wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, violent crack, followed by a deep whump that shook the very foundations of the house. The model boats on the shelves rattled and a fine layer of dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. Jax and Kate both dropped into a defensive crouch. "Tornado," Kate gasped, her eyes wide. "Or a transformer on the main road," Jax added, scanning the ceiling for cracks. Rogue let out a sharp bark, the hackles on his back raised. The house groaned, settled, and then fell into a sudden, eerie silence. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath, and in that quiet, Kate's radio, forgotten on the kitchen counter, suddenly burst to life. It wasn't receiving a voice. It blasted a piercing shriek of static, an electronic burst so loud and sudden it felt like an assault. Eliza Bro didn't react to the falling tree. She reacted to the radio. She screamed. It wasn't a cry of anger, but a raw, agonized sound of pure terror. She sprang from her chair, her hands clamped over her ears. "No, turn it off," she shrieked, her eyes wide with a wild, irrational panic. "Make it stop. You brought it in here. Turn that damn thing off." She was trembling, pointing at the radio as if it were a snake. The sound was just static, a technical glitch caused by the atmospheric disturbance. But she was reacting as if she were being tortured. Kate, stunned by the violent reaction, rushed to the counter and fumbled with the knob, silencing the radio. The room fell back into the howling silence of the storm. Jax and Kate looked at each other. The old woman's panic wasn't about the storm or the flood or the falling tree. It was about the radio. It was a deep, old, and painful wound. The silence after Eliza's scream was heavier than the storm. She was huddled in her chair, trembling, her eyes squeezed shut as if bracing for another blow. Kate stood by the radio, her hand still on the volume knob, her face pale and shaken. Jax watched them both. His mind processed the data. The falling tree, the locked door, the radio, and the old woman's extreme, almost pathological panic. It was a trauma response. "Kate," Jax said, his voice calm and low. "That sound outside was significant. A tree that size or a transformer blowing. You have to report our situation. Turn it back on." Kate looked, her expression conflicted. "Do it. Keep the volume low. We're blind in here. We need information," Jax insisted, his tactical logic overriding the emotional chaos. "It's your duty." The word duty was a trigger for Kate. It pulled her back. She took a deep, steadying breath, her face hardening into the professional mask of Deputy Riley. "Right." She walked around Eliza, returned to the radio, and slowly turned the knob. Eliza flinched, hugging herself, but she didn't scream again. She just watched, her body rigid with dread. A hiss came from the speaker. "All units, the causeway is impassable. Repeat, Parish Road 22 is closed." The dispatcher's voice was a garbled mess, fighting atmospheric interference. "Terrebonne Dispatch, this is 2 Adam 30, Kate said, shouting into her mic. "We are secure at the Bro residence. Mile marker 12. 5. We heard a significant acoustic event. Requesting a situation update." The radio answered with a burst of static. Then another voice cut in, sharp and panicked. It wasn't the dispatcher. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Shrimper Bayou Belle. We're taking on water. Lost engine. Position 5 miles east of Orca Bay. Our pumps." The voice was swallowed by a squeal of feedback. Kate went rigid. Jax saw the blood drain from her face. She wasn't just hearing the call. She was feeling it. "Dispatch to Adam 30. I have that mayday traffic," Kate yelled. "Who's the captain of the Bayou Belle?" A new voice cut in. Calmer, heavier. "The dispatcher." There was a terrible, pitying pause. "Kate. Coast Guard is spinning up. It's Cody." It's your brother. Kate's hand, holding the radio mic, dropped to her side. The mic clattered against her vest. She just stood there, staring at the nautical charts on the wall, but her eyes saw nothing. She was gone. Jax recognized the look. He'd seen it on the faces of soldiers in combat. The moment the mind disconnects from a reality that is too much to bear. Shock. Deputy Riley, Jax said, his voice sharp. A command. She didn't respond. The radio crackled again. Air Station New Orleans has a Jayhawk in the air. ETA, 40 minutes. We need better coordinates. Kate, Jax said, moving into her line of sight. He didn't touch her. Focus. You're their only link right now. You know these waters. Give them something. Her gaze was empty. My brother. He wouldn't. He did, Jax said, forcing her to meet his eyes. He's out there. They're in the air. What do they need to know? The tides, the currents. What do you know that they don't? That broke the spell. The training kicked in. The local knowledge, the burden of being the town's protector. Kate snatched the mic. Dispatch, patch me through to the Coast Guard commander. This is Deputy Riley. Her voice shook, but it was back. For the next 20 minutes, the small, warm room became a command center. Kate paced, energized by a frantic, desperate focus. She pointed at the charts on the wall. No. Tell them they're wrong. If he lost power off Orca, the current in this storm won't push him south. It'll drag him east toward the pipeline terminal. He's not where they're looking. They need to check the shallows near. She was brilliant. She was rattling off coordinates, water depths, and tidal patterns from memory, arguing with a flight commander in New Orleans. Her small-town knowledge battling there by the book search patterns. Rogue, sensing her distress, moved to her side, leaning his heavy body against her leg, offering silent support. Jax watched, impressed. He saw the full weight of her responsibility. She wasn't just a cop in a small town. She was a Riley. She was the one who was supposed to hold the line when the water came calling. In her frantic pacing, she found herself near Eliza's chair. Why? She muttered, speaking more to herself than anyone. He knew the warnings. We all did. Why would he be so reckless? Why would he go out in this? The question hung in the air, heavy with anguish. Eliza Bro, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, looked up. Her face was no longer panicked. It was a flat, gray calm. Reckless, she repeated, her voice a rasp. The water always takes the reckless ones. Kate stopped pacing. What did you say? Eliza's eyes, old and tired, met hers. It takes the fools who won't listen, the ones who think they're stronger than the water, the ones who go out when they're told to stay home. A terrible, cold dread began to dawn on Jax's face as he watched the scene unfold. Eliza's eyes were locked on Kate. You Riley should know that. Kate stepped back as if struck. The radio crackled in her hand. A distant voice asked for confirmation, but she couldn't hear it. The blood had drained from her face again, but this wasn't shock. It was horror. It was the sudden, sickening sound of fractured history snapping into place. Eliza's hatred for her name, the panic at the radio, the locked door. It was all one story. A story that Kate, it seemed, knew all too well. The air in the cabin was thick, unbreathable. Kate stood frozen, the radio in her hand forgotten, the echo of Eliza's words, you Riley should know that, sucking all the warmth from the room. It was an accusation delivered with the weight of a shipwreck. What do you know about my family? Kate's voice was a low, trembling whisper. Eliza Bro just stared, her face a terrain of old pain. I know what the water does, she said, her voice dry. It waits, and then it takes. The radio crackled, saving Kate from the collapsing present. To Adam 30, do you copy? We've lost contact with the Bayou Belle. I repeat, we have lost contact. That was it. The sound of the dispatcher's voice, now tinged with professional pity, broke the spell. Kate's shock fractured, revealing a core of pure, terrible resolve. The color was gone from her face, but her eyes went hard. I'm going, she said. Jax, who had been watching in silence, stepped into her path. You're what? I'm going, she repeated, her voice flat. She began to mechanically check the magazine on her sidearm, a purely muscle memory motion for calm. The Coast Guard is looking near the mouth of the bay. He's not there. If he lost power, the current would drag him toward the pipeline terminal. I know the shallows. I can find him. Deputy, Jax said, his voice low and tactical. You're compromised. You are not thinking clearly. Going out in this storm isn't a rescue. It's suicide. You're no good to your brother dead. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were frighteningly clear. "He's my brother," she said, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did. "He's alive. I can feel it. I know where he is." She grabbed her heavy rain slicker. "This isn't your town, Crow. You don't get it." He stared at her for a long moment. He saw the recklessness, but underneath it, he saw the unbreakable will of a fighter. He knew that look. He'd seen it in deserts and on oceans. He couldn't stop her. "I can't ask you to come," she said, her voice softening for a moment. "But I need you to stay. Watch her." She nodded toward Eliza, who seemed to have shrunk in her chair. "She's not well, and I'm still responsible for her. Call in my position when you can. I'll use the patrol car's radio." Jack stepped aside. He unclipped a high-capacity backup battery pack for his satellite phone from his gear. He pressed it into her hand. "For your radio. It'll last longer than hers." She took it without a word, a silent acknowledgement. "Thanks." She opened the heavy door. The storm, as if waiting, tore through the room, a howling vortex of rain and noise. Then she was gone, and the door slammed shut, plunging the cabin into a sudden, amplified silence. It was just Jax, Eliza, and Rogue. For a long time, nothing moved. The only sounds were the roar of the wind, the groaning of the house, and the occasional tick of the stove. Eliza Bro had retreated. She was no longer angry, no longer panicked. She was a hollowed-out thing, staring at the hundreds of tiny, perfect boats on the wall. Jax maintained his tactical routine. He checked the woodpile. He organized the canned goods. He monitored the windows, though there was nothing to see. He was an anchor of calm in the chaos. Rogue, however, was not calm. The German shepherd, who had been restless since they arrived, was now clearly agitated. He paced from the door Kate had left through, back to Jack's, and then to the other door. The heavy, dark wooden door at the end of the hall, secured by the green brass padlock. He let out a low, anxious sound. "Quiet, boy," Jack said softly. Rogue ignored the command. He went to the door, his nose pressed to the threshold. He whined again, louder. Then he did something he had never done before. He lifted a paw and scratched at the wood. 1, 2, 3 sharp, insistent scrapes. "Rogue." "No." The sound of the dog's claws on the wood finally broke Eliza's trance. She turned her head slowly. She watched the dog. Rogue, feeling her gaze, looked at her, then back at the door and let out a single, pleading bark. "He knows," Eliza whispered, her voice a papery rasp. "He's just agitated by the storm, ma'am," Jack said. "No." She rose from the chair on her own, her movement stiff. She seemed to glide, her feet shuffling on the wood floors, past Jack's, past the armchair, until she stood in the narrow hallway inches from the door. She reached not for her pocket, but for her neck. Her trembling fingers fumbled under the collar of her sweater, pulling out a thin, tarnished silver chain. Hanging from it was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key. It was green with the same patina as the lock. She looked at Jack's, her eyes suddenly, terrifyingly clear. "That deputy, that Riley," she whispered, her voice trembling with an ancient, frozen rage. "She thinks she's the only one. She thinks today is her tragedy. That she's the first to lose a brother, a father, a son to that water." Her shaking hand brought the key to the lock. It slid in with a heavy, metallic scrape. "She thinks she knows what it is to lose everything," Eliza said, her voice breaking. She turned the key. The lock's mechanism was stiff from disuse, but it turned with a loud clunk. The heavy brass padlock fell into her hand. She took the doorknob and pulled. A rush of cold, stale air hit them. It smelled of sawdust, dried glue, and time. Jax reached for the flashlight on his vest, its beam cutting into the darkness. It wasn't a bedroom. It wasn't a storage closet. It was a workshop. The room was frozen in time. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it, it was as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. Tools hung on a pegboard, their shapes outlined in faded chalk. Shavings and curls of wood littered the floor, untouched. And in the center of the room, on a workbench, was a boat. It was a large, beautiful model of a shrimp boat, at least 4 feet long. Its hull was planked, its deckhouse framed, but it was unfinished. The masts were bare, the rigging absent, the cans of paint on the table beside it still sealed. Then Jax's light found the walls. They were papered, not with wallpaper, but with newspaper clippings, dozens of them, laminated against the damp, yellowed and brittle. They all carried the same headlines from the Terrebonne Parish Gazette, 30 years ago. Orion lost at sea. All souls presumed lost. Search enters third week for Cordova fishing vessel. Memorial held for Cordova's lost fathers and sons. Eliza stepped into the room, her feet leaving the first new prints in the dust. She reached out and placed a trembling hand on the model's unfinished hull. "He was going to be a boat builder," she whispered, her back to Jack's. "My boy. He was 16. He was building this for the high school regatta." Eliza's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the howl of the storm. She remained in the workshop, her fingers tracing the unfinished hull of the model boat. "Leo. My son. He was 16. She spoke not to Jax, but to the dusty room, to the ghosts. His father, Thomas, was the captain of the Orion. Leo was his shadow. He lived for the water. He was a good boy. Jax remained in the doorway, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the scene, respecting the memorial. Rogue stood beside him, his agitation gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful presence. "What happened, Eliza?" Jax asked, his voice low. Eliza's hand stilled. She turned, her eyes finding his in the gloom. They were no longer the flat, angry eyes of the woman in the armchair. They were deep, empty wells of memory. "A storm. Just like this one. It came up out of the Gulf, fast and mean. They called it a rogue wave, a freak of nature." She gave a short, dry laugh. "A storm is a storm. They went out for a 3-day trip, and they didn't come back." She left the cold workshop, walking stiffly back to the oppressive warmth of the stove. Jax followed. She sank into her chair, the sudden movement seeming to drain the last of her energy. "They sent the parish sheriff's boat," she continued, her voice hardening, losing its fragility and gaining a brittle, cold anger. "The Aegis. Its captain was a young man, ambitious, full of rules and regulations, full of himself." She stared at the fire visible through the stove's small grate. "He called off the search after 3 days. 3 days. Her hands clenched. "Standard procedure. Outside the survivability window, he called it. My Thomas. He was the best waterman in Terrebonne Parish. He could survive anything in that water. He had survival gear. He had flares. I told them." "You told them where to look?" Jax prompted. "I told them," she hissed. "I told them the current would have pushed them east, toward the barrier islands. I knew it. But the sheriff wouldn't listen. He wouldn't deviate. He followed his maps, not his gut. He looked me right in the eye and told me I was hysterical." She paused, the silence in the room stretching, heavy and suffocating. The sheriff's name was Patrick Riley. Kate's father. The name landed in the room and stayed there. It was the key. It explained 30 years of isolation, the hatred of the Riley name, the shelves filled with maritime memorials, and the deep, agonizing panic when she heard the static of a rescue radio. It was the sound of her failure, and his. Jax turned away from her, pacing to the small window, looking out into the white void. The story settled in him, heavy as wet snow. It wasn't just grief he heard in her voice. It was the 30-year-old corrosive acid of helplessness. The feeling of waiting, knowing something is wrong while the experts make the wrong calls. He knew that feeling. He had lived it. His mind flashed to a dusty rooftop in Kandahar. The crackle of a radio. A call he should have made a second sooner. A teammate who moved left instead of right. The echoing gunshot. The silence after, the feeling of being the one left, the one who had to run the scenario over and over, wondering if one different word, one different decision, would have changed the outcome. The unique, hollow guilt of the survivor. "It's not the loss that breaks you," Jax said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at her. He was speaking to the storm, to his own ghosts. "It's the what if. It's being the one left behind. The one who has to second guess every moment, wondering if you could have done more." Eliza's head came up. She studied him, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just a stranger, a large man who had broken her window. He was familiar. "You've been there," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've waited for a call that didn't come." Jax gave a single, short, military nod of acknowledgement. "We all have our storms, ma'am. The ones we get stuck in." He turned back to her. "You built this house," he gestured around the fortress-like room, "to keep the storm out. But that room," he nodded toward the workshop. "You locked that to keep the storm in." Eliza held his gaze. The silence in the cabin was different now. Shared. Rogue, sensing the shift, moved from the hallway and rested his heavy head on Jax's knee. "That deputy, Kate," Eliza said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "She's just like him, her father. Reckless. She's running right into the water, just like he did." "She's running to save her brother," Jax corrected gently. "Makes no difference. The water will take her, too. It always takes the reckless Rileys. Maybe, Jax said. Or maybe she'll be the one who breaks the pattern. Eliza looked at him, her gaze sharp and analytical, the way she must have looked at her nautical charts. She studied his posture, his quiet, centered energy. He hadn't panicked at the flood. He hadn't flinched at her anger. He hadn't wavered. He had just endured. You're not like them, she said, her voice filled with a strange, sudden certainty. You're not the water. You're not the storm. You're the rock. The thing the storm breaks against. As the word rock hung in the air, Rogue's head shot up. The dog's ears flattened, and he let out a low rumble directed at the front door. Quiet, boy, Jax murmured. He'd heard it too. Underneath the high-pitched shriek of the wind, there was a new sound. A low, mechanical grinding. An engine straining terribly nearby. Jax moved to the door. His hand instinctively going to the small of his back, a lifelong habit, though he was unarmed. He peered through the small window. Two figures, illuminated in the flashing blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser, which was still miraculously running, were stumbling up the levee path. They were two dark shapes in the blinding white. He threw the heavy door open. The storm crashed in a violent, cold wave of rain and spray. It was Kate. She was half carrying, half dragging a man. Her face was a mask of mud, her slicker torn at the shoulder. The man she was supporting was a dead weight. Get inside, Jax yelled, grabbing the man's other arm. It was Cody Riley. He looked to be in his late 20s, but appeared older, gaunt. His face was a pale blue, his lips colorless, his eyes rolled back. He was soaked, wearing only a thin jacket and jeans, useless against the gulf. He was dying. They hauled him inside and Kate collapsed in the doorway, her legs giving out. He's alive, she gasped, her voice breaking, her chest heaving. I found him in the cypress roots. He's alive. The cabin door slammed shut, an oak and iron punctuation mark that sealed out the storm and sealed in the crisis. For a second, the three of them were frozen in a tableau. Kate, collapsed by the door, gasping for air. Eliza, a statue of ancient shock by her chair, and Cody, a blue-lipped, half-drowned man, unconscious on the wooden floor. Jax moved first. The switch was flipped. The quiet strategist was gone, replaced by the soldier. This was a battlefield, and Cody was his casualty. Kate, he snapped, his voice a clean, hard blade that cut through her shock. He's severely hypothermic. He's dying. I need you to be Deputy Riley for 10 more minutes. Can you do that? She looked up, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. Can you do that? He repeated. Yes, she whispered, the word a gasp. Good. Get him away from the door. Get his wet clothes off him now. He turned to Eliza, who was staring at the wet, motionless form of Cody Riley with a distant, cold expression. Eliza, stop looking. I need blankets. Every blanket and towel you have. And I need you to heat water, not for a bath, for bottles. Go. The authority in his voice, the undeniable force of his command, broke their paralysis. Kate, moving on instinct, scrambled to her brother. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't work his zipper. I can't. Use your knife, Jax commanded, already dragging the heavy armchair closer to the stove. Cut them off. Rogue. Watch the door. Stay. The German shepherd, who had been pacing anxiously, immediately sat, his eyes locked on the front door, guarding the outside while Jax managed the inside. Kate drew her service knife. The sound of the blade tearing through wet denim and nylon was violent in the small room. Eliza, moving stiffly like a woman in a dream, began pulling dry, musty-smelling blankets from a sea chest. They moved Cody onto a dry blanket near the stove. He was frighteningly still. His skin, where it was exposed, was waxy and pale, tinged a grayish blue. His breathing was shallow, a faint, fluttering rattle. He's not shivering, Kate said, her voice edged with panic. Why isn't he shivering? Because he's past it, Jax said grimly, his fingers checking the carotid artery in Cody's neck. The pulse was weak, thready. Shivering is the body's last attempt to warm itself. His core temperature is too low. His body has given up. He began to work with quick, precise movements. Kate, dry him. Pat, don't rub. Rubbing can push cold blood from his limbs back to his heart and stop it. We warm the core, not the extremities. He grabbed jars from the kitchen. Eliza, water. Eliza returned with a kettle, her hands shaking. It's hot. Jax filled 3 glass jars, sealed them, and then wrapped them tightly in thick wool socks. He placed them with practiced, unemotional efficiency. One on Cody's neck, one under each armpit, one in his groin. This is how we do it. We force warmth back into the core. Kate, get the driest blanket, the wool one. He wrapped Cody tightly, mummifying him in dry layers. The two women, forced into this strange, intimate triage, worked together, their animosity forgotten, replaced by a single, desperate task. For an hour, the only sounds were the storm's roar and Jax's low commands. Check his breathing. More hot water. Keep him covered. Then it happened. A single, violent tremor racked Cody's body. His teeth chattered. A sound like rattling dice. Kate gasped. He's shivering, Jax said, the tension easing in his shoulders. That's good. His body is fighting back. He's not safe yet, but he's fighting. He squatted down, finally taking a breath. He'd been so focused he hadn't noticed Kate was now shivering too, her own slicker soaked from the rescue. Your turn, deputy. Get out of the wet clothes or I'll have two patients. Kate ignored him. She was watching Cody as his eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glazed with confusion. Kate, he mumbled, his voice a rasp. I'm here, Cody. I'm here, she said, taking his hand. You idiot, you absolute idiot. What were you thinking? The relief was gone, replaced by the sharp, familiar anger of a sister. The storm warnings were out for 2 days. You're the best small boat handler in the parish. What were you doing out there? Cody Riley looked away. His gaunt face, now slowly regaining color, was etched with a familiar shame. He was the family disappointment, the one who always had a story, always had an excuse. I had to, Kate. You had to what? Fish? No, he mumbled, his eyes on the ceiling. It was a debt. I owed some guys, from New Orleans. Kate's face shifted from anger to a cold, sick dread. What kind of debt? Doesn't matter. They said if I didn't meet them, if I didn't run the package out to the rig, they were gonna come for me. I just thought I could beat the storm. I got a fouled prop and water. Kate stood up. She looked at her brother, the man she had just pulled from the sea, and her expression was one of complete, devastating shame. A gambling debt. You were running a package. You risked a Coast Guard helicopter. You risked my life. You lied to everyone for a bookie in New Orleans. Kate, no, she whispered. She turned her back on him, walking to the far wall, pressing her forehead against a cold nautical chart. She was utterly broken. All the strength, all the duty, all the Riley pride had shattered. Her brother wasn't a reckless fisherman. He was a common criminal. Eliza, who had watched all of this from her chair, said nothing. She just observed. Cody, shivering, delirious from returning blood flow and a budding fever, tried to sit up. Kate, I'm sorry. His unfocused gaze drifted past his sister, past Jax, and landed on the old woman sitting in the shadows. His eyes widened, not with recognition, but with a fevered confusion. Mrs. Bro, he rasped. Kate turned. Cody, be quiet. You're delirious. You don't know her. No, I do, he mumbled, his eyes blinking slowly. From Dad's study. The picture. His eyes were fixed on Eliza, a ghost from his father's past. Mrs. Bro, I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. He tried. Eliza went rigid. What? Dad, Cody said, his words slurring, the fever taking over. He never stopped. The Orion. He spent nights, charts all over the wall, looking for the currents. He said he was wrong. He said he should have listened. Kate's hand went to her mouth. Cody, what are you talking about? He tried to find them, Cody mumbled, his eyes closing. He died trying to find them. Eliza Bro stood up. She didn't look at Cody. She didn't look at Kate. She walked to the small, rain-streaked window, her back to the room. Jax and Kate watched as the implications of Cody's delirious words settled over them. The story Eliza had held for 30 years, of a cold, heartless officer following the rules, was a lie. The truth was worse. Sheriff Patrick Riley was a haunted man, one who had passed his failure down to his son. Eliza stood there, her silhouette against the churning, gray sky. Her shoulders began to shake. It wasn't the violent shudder of her earlier panic. It was a deep, rhythmic, internal collapse. And then they heard it, a sound she hadn't made, by her own admission, in 30 years. A single, dry, agonizing sob that broke the frozen silence of the fortress. The storm wasn't broken. It was released. Sometime in the gray, exhausted hours before dawn, the roar of the wind subsided to a mournful sigh, and the constant, Violent assault of rain against the windows became a soft, defeated tapping. Inside the fortress, there was only silence. Eliza's sobs had faded hours ago, leaving her a hollowed, fragile figure in her chair. She hadn't slept. She just watched the stove, her face an empty map of a territory that had been completely redrawn. Kate had finally succumbed to exhaustion, dozing in a hardback chair near her brother, her own face tear-streaked, etched with the dual pain of shame for Cody and a new, complicated grief for the father she never really knew. Jax remained awake. The soldier. He was on watch. He monitored Cody's breathing, which had steadied into a shallow, feverish rhythm. He fed wood to the stove. He was the anchor, the rock Eliza had called him. He just held the space. The first sound of the new day wasn't the sun. It was a sound from the sky. A heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that cut through the thinning clouds. Helicopter, Jax said, moving to the window. A.U.S. Coast Guard Jayhawk in its signature orange and white was fighting the last of the crosswinds. Its searchlight cut a brilliant white cone through the pre-dawn light. Kate was on her feet instantly, her fatigue vanished. "They're here." She fumbled for her radio, her hands shaking. "The battery." Jax was already handing her his satellite phone, which he'd kept charged. "They'll be on a separate frequency. Tell them 60 to 12 by 15. Give them the levy coordinates. Tell them we have one hypothermic male, stabilized." For 10 minutes, Kate was Deputy Riley again, calmly directing the aircraft. The helicopter didn't land. The levee was too precarious. It entered a high, stable hover, and 2 figures descended on a winch cable. The heavy front door opened and 2 new men stepped in, bringing a blast of cold air and the smell of jet fuel. They were Coast Guard rescue swimmers. The lead, a petty officer Cole, was a young man with calm eyes and an intensely professional, efficient demeanor. He took in the scene at a glance, saw Cody mummified in blankets, saw the labeled jars, and saw Jax. "Who administered primary care?" Cole asked. "I did," Jax said. Cole checked Cody's pulse and noted the core rewarming setup. He looked at Jax with a new respect. "This is textbook. You kept him alive." He turned to his partner. "We have a viable patient. Package him. We fly in 5. They worked quickly, transferring Cody to a stabilized litter. As they were strapping him in, Cody's eyes fluttered open, his gaze feverish. He saw Kate. "Kate, be quiet, Cody," she said, her voice hard, but her hand was gentle as she brushed the damp hair from his forehead. "You just focus on getting better. We'll talk about the rest later." Petty Officer Cole looked at Kate. "Deputy, are you flying out with him?" Kate looked at her brother, the source of her family's shame and her current duty. Then she looked around the cabin, at Eliza, at her abandoned patrol car somewhere down the road, at the town she was sworn to protect. "No," she said, her voice firm. "He's your patient now. My duty is here." Cole nodded, understanding. "He'll be at Terrebonne General. We'll let them know." With a roar from the engines, the litter was winched up into the belly of the Jayhawk. The helicopter gained altitude, dipped its nose, and vanished into the clouds. Cody was gone. The returning silence was profound. Jax, Kate, and Eliza stood in the open doorway, the new, clean cold air swirling around them. The storm had passed, and for the first time in 3 days, a single, weak ray of sun broke through the gray, illuminating the millions of tiny ice crystals in the air. Eliza Bro looked at the beam of light, then moved with a stiffness that was more than age, past them. She went to the front door, still ajar. She pushed it wide open. The morning sun, now gaining strength, flooded the cluttered, dark room. It illuminated the dust, the models, the charts, and the truth. She propped the door open with a heavy boot, letting the clean, cold air of the new day finally enter her home. Jax turned to Kate. "My training leave is over, Deputy. I need to report back to my unit. I'd be grateful for a ride into town if you think your cruiser is salvageable." Kate nodded, a lump in her throat. "Of course." She paused, struggling for words. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. You didn't just save Cody." She looked down at the floor, at the scar on her wrist. "I spent my whole life trying to be an officer like my father. Or at least, the officer I thought he was. A cold, by the book Riley." She met his eyes, her own wet. I never knew he was haunted. I never knew he was human. You gave me my family's history back, Crow. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You just did," Jax said. "Get your gear." Kate nodded and went outside to try and dig out her patrol car. Jax gathered his minimalist pack. Rogue, who had been a silent pillar of stability through it all, rose and stretched, ready for the next mission. Jax turned to Eliza. She was standing at her main workbench, the one in the living room. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were different. The brittle, icy anger was gone. They were just tired, and clear. He saw that she had not been sleeping. On the workbench amid the debris was a small block of cypress and her carving tools. She had been working. "You kept busy last night," he said. "Idle hands are a curse," she replied, her voice raspy. "I had to fix something." She picked up a small, newly finished model. It was tiny, perfect, and painted in the white and red of the U.S. Coast Guard. It was a replica of a high-endurance cutter. The Aegis, Jax recognized it from the charts. "I was wrong," Eliza said, her voice soft. "He wasn't a rule. He was just a man. He was haunted, same as me." She held the model out to Jax. "He was a rock, too, and the water. It just wore him down." She pressed the small, heavy model into Jax's hand. "You said you were stuck in your own storms. You said I was, too. You were right." Her cold, weathered hand briefly clasped his. "You are the rock, Mr. Crow. But I've learned something. Even rocks need an anchor, or the tide will pull them out to sea." Jax looked at the little boat. It was forgiveness. It was release. It was a promise. He closed his hand around it and nodded to her. He didn't need to say anything. He walked to the door, Rogue at his side. Kate was waiting, her patrol car idling, its blue lights flashing in the brilliant, blinding new snow. She had seen the exchange. She said nothing. Jax and Kate looked at each other, a long, silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. It wasn't a promise of a future. It was a simple, profound understanding. Jax gave a single nod, tucked the little boat into his pocket, and walked with Rogue down the cliffside path into the new, clean world. He had come to Port Forkin seeking the cold, a way to harden himself. But in the darkest, most isolated fortress, in the heart of the storm, he had found something he wasn't looking for. A strange, complicated, and undeniable human warmth.